Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. Well, ending months of vote-related tension, Afghanistan's Election Commission has finally named a new president on Sunday. This happened only after the two leading candidates, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, signed a power-sharing deal that names one of them as the country's new chief executive. The deal brings to a close an election season that began in April, when millions of Afghans first went to the polls despite threats from Taliban militants. The US officials have lauded the deal and are waiting to sign a bilateral security agreement to allow some 10,000 American forces to remain in Afghanistan next year. But there are several other challenges that the new administration in Afghanistan faces, both from within the country and outside. So we'll discuss the dynamics of the Afghan elections and its result in today's edition of Insight. And joining me in the program is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, who's associated with the O.P. Jindal Global University. And Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, what is also very important here to see is that the Taliban challenge remains one of the crucial challenges that the new administration would be facing. And Taliban has already rejected the idea of the new unity government there in Afghanistan. What do you think how do you think is this going to be, is going to really turn out in the next few months or in the next year to say?
The Taliban have actually denounced the pact, saying that these two candidates are employees of the US ambassador, and they've said it's a shameful deal and so on. If you remember, they had not supported the electoral process anyway, all the way through. And the summer offensive, this summer, it's been really hot. They've increased the tempo of the attacks. Last I heard was there were like 700 attacks. At least recorded.
That's right,
ones.
In the first year.
It's a record for this first half of the year.
That's right.
And clearly they benefited from the vacuum that was happening because of this, limbo where there was no decision and there were ballots being counted, recounted, audit, and so on. So I think, and the fact that Abdullah is in the government, I think will make them warier, because Abdullah goes back to the Northern Alliance, which had fought the Taliban tooth and nail. And Abdullah was a confidant of the great Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had been a thorn in the flesh for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda for a long time. So I think they are going to view this as a negative result insofar as the security agencies. I mean, now the division of powers between the president and the CEO or potentially the prime minister is going to be such that they are trying to go and create, the old Tajik domination within the security services is likely to continue. It won't be diluted very much because Abdullah is there to make sure that happens. And what that means is that the Taliban will view this as a kind of an infidel state or an apostate state anyway, because they don't represent the Pashtun interests. And Ghani, again, because in Afghanistan the tribe and ethnicity and interpersonal ego tussles are so rampant, Ghani himself comes from Ahmadzai, which is one of the subsects of the Ghilzai. So in that sense, it's a challenge again to Taliban, because Taliban, leadership and the bulk come also from Ghilzai, and to some extent from the lower classes of the Durrani, the other major confederation. So both these figures are antithetical to Taliban's core interests. But nonetheless, I mean, I think the Afghan army is now, 350,000 strong? And it's, at least numerically, it's large. They're taking a lot of body blows from Taliban. But nonetheless, without enough air cover and air support from the NATO, as used to be the case before. And with 10,000 troops left after the signing of the bilateral agreement, they will, in the front lines, will always be up to the Afghans. So I am hopeful that the Taliban will see sense, because at the end of the day it's Afghan versus Afghan, and they can't claim that these are still puppets. The only reason they could claim is that these are receiving aid. The current state remains dependent on donors. But the fact is that Afghans spilling other Afghans' blood has gone on for so long. So I do hope that the drawdown of the Americans to just 10,000, hopefully, will in a way limit the, control the bloodletting to some extent. But on the other hand, the security situation is pretty dire. And at the end of the day, these two gentlemen, Ghani and Abdullah, have to show a kind of leadership potential which will also inspire the military. because the rate of desertions, the lack of professional quality despite so much Western aid gone into training them, clearly shows in some of these what they call the blue on green attacks and so on, which was internal, or friendly fire incidents. All of these showed the security force in poor light. So I think Taliban will be looking to carve out and continue to expand from their southern bases, but also further to the east where they are strong, and to gain further territory and then be in a bargaining position with the new regime.
So he still remains the player.
One issue about the distraction, the analogy to 2003, I don't think it's valid today because, see, 2003 the Americans pumped in hundreds of thousands of forces into Iraq. Today we are not talking about American ground forces either in Syria or in Iraq anywhere to that scale. The most radical estimate is 5,000 people. So they're only talking about aerial bombing and so on. So I don't think Afghanistan is going to get strategically neglected by the Americans or disregarded or downgraded in their priority list because of the campaign in Syria and Iraq. Rather what we are seeing is it's Obama who's driving this demilitarization and to get out and he wants not to be remembered as a war president. So I think that the downsizing of forces, 10,000, they're going to be doing so-called counter-terrorism, and so I think in a way the lighter footprint is good for Afghanistan because in the long run, without the red rag to the bull of the Americans, the Taliban cannot keep on calling for blood.
Okay. And Dr. Chaulia, as we talked about, of course, the Taliban challenge which the Afghanistan government faces, and along with that there are some other inherent problems. The corruption issue is one of the crucial issues. The economy, which is really not doing well, that's one of the critical things. Jobs, other requirements which every average individual may have from a state, from the government, those are the challenges. How do you look at, on that front, how do you see the road ahead?
On that front, it's good news Ashraf Ghani is in charge, because if you go back to his earlier tenure as a finance minister under Karzai, he had tried to streamline a lot of the governance processes. He had tried to introduce a tax system. He was the author of the idea of going after corrupt people and trying to limit their influence. Although he took General Dostam, one of the feared warlords, Uzbek warlords, as his running mate, he has been trying to say that, we are going to govern in a way that does not keep on doing spoils distribution, but rather, creates a kind of ownership on the part of the people in the stability of the state. Right now, the state is seen by many people as illegitimate for various reasons, both because the processes have been flawed, be it the elections or whatnot. The other is, of course, the capability of the security forces to deliver, and the civil servants and the bureaucrats to have the autonomy and the power and the budgets to implement developmental schemes and so on. All these have been lacking. So I think Mr. Ghani is probably the best bet because he has a UN background, he was in the World Bank, he's been talking about how systems can be reformed. So I think he is the one among all these candidates, if you look at the array of the people who had contested, who has the best potential claim to be leading a kind of a reform bandwagon. But of course, as my colleagues have mentioned here, he's in many ways shackled by the camps that come behind them and their interests, and the big man culture has been there in the past where people want to arrogate to themselves as much power and don't want to create a national project. Everyone is out to protect one's own turf and fiefdom. So I think he'll have to play out of his skin and create a kind of a inspiration in the society. Mr. Ghani was originally considered to be weak in elocution and in speech making, but he came into his own during the campaigning, and in many ways he disproved some of the critics saying he was phlegmatic and didn't have the kind of charisma like Abdullah and so on. So I think the president, if for no other reason because the constitution has a unitary state and a presidential system with a lot of powers concentrated in him, will continue to be looked upon to offer the lead in tackling corruption and setting an example. Mr. Karzai, for all his merits, had a bad record in this because his family and the nepotism and Ahmad Wali and then his cousins, they had stashed away so much wealth. So I hope that Mr. Ghani, through personal example, will lead a new towards a new dawn. But it's all optimistic because of the he's shackled by the structural problem. Wazir Akbar Khan is a hill outside Kabul where recently Mr. Naveen Jindal, who is Chancellor of our university, erected Afghanistan's largest monumental flag. And it stands out in the landscape today if you go to Kabul. And this is the kind of intervention that India needs to be making more, not just the public sector, where we have invested over $2 billion, but private sector, Indian private sector needs to come in, at least in zones where there is stability, and strengthen the economy, local economy, and create unifying examples and symbols that will raise the stature and the mindset of the people to different levels. Say, we fought enough, and now, it's a time for a new dawn. Unity government, let's really create unity in our hearts and minds.
Okay, that's all we have for you in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.